Take a deep breath, because what I'm going to tell you now will overturn everything you've learned about good and evil. What if I told you that the demons you were taught to fear in church were not evil creatures, but rather ancient African guardians, and that their transformation into evil beings was the greatest propaganda operation in history, deliberately done to erase African spirituality and replace it with European Christianity? Well, while you were praying for protection from evil spirits, you were actually being taught to reject your own ancestors. Today I'm going to show you how it happened, who did it, and why it worked so well that even today most people don't even suspect it. And look, if you have the courage to question everything you've been taught, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because this kind of truth needs to reach those who are ready to wake up. Now hold on tight, because the invisible battle I'm about to reveal is darker and more calculated than you can imagine. At the dawn of forgotten times, before foreign winds brought their truths, the African lands pulsed with an ancestral harmony where heaven and earth spoke in an eternal song. Under the majestic shade of the baobab trees, the elders narrated stories of a time when the Nkisi, Oryxars and Vadzimu walked alongside men, beings of power and mystery, guardians of universal balance. The savannas echoed with the sounds of drums, beaten with a firm hand, rhythmic to the pulse of life. Each beat was an invocation, a call to the invisible forces that permeated the air, the rivers and the mountains. Those lands were alive, and every element, from the finest leaf to the oldest rock, carried the wisdom of the ages. On clear nights, when the stars twinkled like watchful eyes, communities gathered around the bonfires, and the flames danced to the sound of voices that sang songs of gratitude and reverence. The Nkisi of Congo, carved in wood and iron, stood like sentinels in homes, ready to offer protection and advice. They were the eyes that saw beyond the veil of reality, the ears that heard the whisper of the ancestors. In Nigeria, the Oryxars, each with their own domain and personality, were celebrated in festivals of colors and dances, where life was honored in its multiple facets. And in Zimbabwe, the Vadzimu, spirits of the ancestors, were the guides who ensured that the path taken was in harmony with the destiny traced by the gods. These entities were not invoked in fear, but in respect, as intrinsic parts of the spiritual tapestry that defined existence. The relationship with the sacred was one of interdependence, a continuous cycle of life, death, and rebirth, where each being had its place and purpose. However, with the arrival of the missionaries, the winds changed direction. Foreigners, bearers of a faith that claimed to be unique, saw African spirituality as a challenge to their dominance. For them, the invisible should be visible, the sacred profane. Thus, in their eyes, the Nkisi became idols of darkness, the Orishas, beings of deception, and the Vadzimu, mere shadows of superstition. The drums, which once resounded with the heartbeat of the land, were silenced, their voices considered threats to the new creed. The offerings, expressions of love and respect, were labeled heresy. And in an attempt to erase the ancestral memory, the protectors were transformed into demons, eclipsing the light of a rich and complex spirituality. This clash was not just a fight for souls, but an invisible battle for the very spirit of a continent. For by delegitimizing the ancestral guardians, the missionaries not only sought to convert, but to rewrite the very essence of what it meant to be African. And so, under the watchful gaze of the stars, resistance began to form, silent and unwavering, like a river that never forgets its course. The winds of destiny blew strongly over the savannas, carrying with them murmurs of ancient times when earth and sky were one song. Under the canopies of majestic baobab trees, communities lived in harmony with the invisible, where every leaf, every stone, every creature was a note in the eternal symphony of the cosmos. But, like a storm rising on the horizon, the foreigners arrived, carrying their truths like iron blades, sharp and unforgiving. Behold, the first signs of strangeness began to manifest themselves like shadows that slide silently under the moonlight. The missionaries, with their heavy clothes and inquisitive looks, entered the villages, hoping to find a spiritual void that they could fill with their doctrines. But instead, they came across a fertile soil of living, pulsating spirituality, a world of rituals and wisdom that defied their expectations. The Ancestral, carved with precision and reverence, were more than just objects. They were bridges to the divine, resounding the voices of the ancestors. The Oryxars, with their stories and lessons, were celebrations of life itself, manifestos of resistance and joy. The Vadzimu, the whisperers of the ancients, were the guardians of the paths, ensuring that the steps taken were firm and safe. However, for the missionaries, this spiritual wealth became an obstacle. How could they bring new light if there were already so many stars shining? How could they proclaim a single truth when so many already echoed in the songs of the elders? The solution, painful as it was, came in the form of a distorted narrative: demonization. Rituals that were once considered celebrations of life were labeled as possession dances. Invocations to ancestors who wove links between past and present became dark pacts. Offerings, gestures of deep respect and love, were transformed into witchcraft practices. So the missionaries, like weavers of a new fabric of dominion, rewrote the names of the spirits. The Ancestral, once protectors, were disfigured into demons. The Oryxars, bearers of light, demoted to shadow entities. The Vadzimu, wise guides, seen as evil spirits. With the Bible in one hand and the power of the colonizer in the other, the missionaries quoted their scriptures, speaking words of condemnation and demanding submission. The passages that spoke of idols and demons were used as weapons, each verse a blow against the African spiritual essence. And under the weight of this power, many began to doubt their own ancestry, questioning the value of their traditions. However, in private letters sent overseas, some missionaries confessed their doubts. They admired the miraculous cures they witnessed, the wisdom that emanated from the elders, and the order and morality that permeated African societies. But these confessions were muffled whispers, incapable of altering the course of a larger project where inferiority was necessary to dominate, and where attacking spirituality was the deepest form of subjugation. However, deep in the forests and in the hearts of the people, resistance was forming. Like underground rivers that never forget their path, the ancestral essence continued to flow, indomitable and eternal, awaiting the moment to emerge and resurface with the strength of a new dawn. For the spirit of a continent is not easily extinguished. It shines silent and powerful under the watchful gaze of the stars. In times when the rising sun dyed the savannas with its golden colors, an ancestral decree crossed the seas, coming from distant lands, carried by winds that whispered a dark destiny. The Catholic Church, with its mantle of authority, had decided that African spirituality must be crushed under the weight of its doctrines. It was no longer just isolated voices of missionaries. Now, it was an official ruling that reverberated like thunder across the continent. The priests, with crosses in their hands and authority in their gestures, became agents of a new type of storm. Instructions clear as steel were given: destroy the altars that, for centuries, had been the meeting point between the world of the living and that of the ancestors. Burn the sacred objects, each one a piece of the mystical tapestry that wove African life. Prohibit rituals that sang harmony between the human and the divine. If necessary, forcibly convert those who still kept the flame of their traditions burning. And there were consequences for those who dared to resist. Iron and fire became implacable judges. Entire villages, which refused to bend to the new creed, were wiped off the face of the earth, their stories erased as if they were leaves in the wind. Men and women who maintained the faith of their ancestors were imprisoned, their bodies marked by torture, their lives offered for sacrifice. Children, seeds of the future, were torn from their homes, taken to missions where the shame of their own ancestral blood was taught to them as truth. They grew up under the weight of a distorted identity, where what was once light was now darkness. But in the shadows of this act of erasure, an irony danced silently and cunningly. While the surface was marked by destruction, deep down the missionaries themselves began to recognize the hidden brilliance in the traditions they sought to eradicate. In their hearts, a secret curiosity blossomed, and they soon became clandestine scholars of African practices. They fervently noted healing rituals, kept formulas that could defy illness, mapped the heavens with the astronomical wisdom of the elders. This knowledge, like seeds planted on foreign soil, was sent back to Europe. There, under new names, they were celebrated as enlightened discoveries. The African genius, however, was left in the shadows, its creators forgotten, its voices silenced by a cloak of invisibility imposed. The stolen legacy was clothed in new garments, and those who originated it were erased from the narratives of glory. However, in the heart of African lands, resistance did not fall asleep. Like a flame that refuses to be extinguished, the ancestral spirit continued to shine. In the songs whispered on full moon nights, in the stories whispered at the foot of the baobab trees, the memory of the ancestral protectors remained alive. Demonization may have planted seeds of doubt, but the roots of identity were too deep to be uprooted easily. Future generations, born under the shadow of a reviled spirituality, began to feel the ancestral pulse in their veins. The call of the drums, although silenced, still echoed in their hearts. For they knew that salvation did not come from outside, but from the recognition that they were connected to a sacred lineage, where each individual was an indispensable piece in the eternal dance of life. And so, under the protective gaze of the stars, the silent resistance prepared its return. Like a river that never ceases its course, waiting for the moment to break the barriers and rediscover its path to freedom. And so, under the vast blanket of stars that never cease to watch, a new dance of resistance unfolded, where the ancestors found ways to echo their voices across time and space. Traditions, which many believed had been stifled, have resurfaced, not as shadows of the past, but as living testaments to an immortal wisdom. Syncretism, with its cunning and ability to adapt, became the bridge between worlds, between the visible and the invisible, between what was and what could still be. In the distant lands of America, where Africans were taken against their will, their souls nevertheless remained untamed. Disguise became their weapon, and in the harmonious combination between Catholic saints and Oryxars, they found a way to keep the ancestral flame alive. Candomblé, Umbanda, Voodoo, and Santeria were not just religions of resistance, but songs of survival, where each drumbeat reverberated like a beating heart, each song a cry for freedom. But in the motherland itself, where the ancestral roots were deepest, the battle took another form. In cities that grew under the watchful eye of a changing world, evangelization and demonization went hand in hand, like two sides of the same coin. Pentecostal and neo-Pentecostal churches, like merciless winds, swept away traditions, promising liberations in exchange for obedience. And in the squares where once the drums sang, now rose the sound of iron and fire. Sacred objects turned to ashes, memories reduced to dust. The pastors, with their fiery words, created an industry of fear, selling the idea that African roots were the source of all evil. The promise of liberation became currency, and disorder and despair a profitable market. And people, plunged into confusion, accepted this new narrative, believing that their sufferings were the result of ancestral curses, which only the new God could undo. But in the shadow of this storm, a quiet turn began to take shape. Scholars, driven by a desire for truth, began to look at these traditions with new eyes, stripped of colonial veils. Anthropologists, progressive theologians, and free thinkers discovered the truth that had always been there. Ancient practices were expressions of a deep understanding of the cosmos, focused on balance, healing, and a sacred connection to the earth and the divine. These discoveries, however, were not echoed by churches that had built empires on demonization, for to recognize the beauty and complexity of African spiritual systems would be to dismantle the very basis of their power. And so the truth remained a whisper among a few, a flame burning in the minds that dared to question. But in the heart of Africa, where the blood of the ancestors still runs strong, resistance never died. Like underground rivers, traditions continued to flow, invisible but ever present. And on full moon nights under the watchful eye of the baobab trees, communities still gathered to share stories, remember ancient times, and dream of the day when true freedom would reign again. For destiny cannot be erased, and the essence of a people cannot be silenced. Beneath the vast African sky, silent resistance grows, like a tree whose roots stretch across the entire continent. And although the invisible battle continues, The ancestral spirit will never be defeated, just waiting for the right moment to resurface with the strength of a new dawn to light the way back to eternal harmony. Beneath the ancient sky that has witnessed ages of stories and songs, a revelation advances like a river, flowing into lands thirsty for truth. The demonization of African ancestral protectors was not a mistake. It was not an innocent slip in the chronicles of theology. It was, yes, a weapon, a sharp blade used in the invisible war that sought to subdue, silence, and erase the living essence of a continent. For by convincing a people that their spiritual guides are demons, the vital link to identity is severed, the tree is uprooted by the roots, leaving the fertile soil of a culture exposed and vulnerable to the dominance of new seeds. And so, under the watchful eyes of the ancestors who never stopped watching, the winds blew stories of a time when connection with the divine was as natural as breathing. But like a storm that arrives without warning, the missionaries' narrative fell over these lands like a blanket of darkness, erasing the memory of the stars. A people without roots, without pride, without the internal pulse of resistance, becomes malleable, easy to dominate, colonize, enslave. Thus the strategy not only worked, but was perpetuated through the centuries, still echoing today, like a melancholy song of souls who learned to fear what was once revered. In the shadows of modern cities, where concrete has replaced earth, many Africans and their descendants continue to carry the burden of a taught fear. They fear the rituals that once connected their ancestors with the cosmos. They tremble before the Oryxars, whose dances and songs were transformed into whispers of terror, because they were taught that to invoke the ancestors is to open the doors to demons. But the truth, which was hidden between the folds of time, is that the real demons were those who, with crosses raised, destroyed temples, tortured priests, and planted shame in the minds of generations. And while African traditions were burned, European traditions, many of which were equally rooted in ancient and animistic practices, were maintained and even celebrated. Christmas, with its roots in pagan Roman festivals, and Easter, originating in fertility rituals, were adapted into the mantle of Christianity. Catholic saints, often mere transpositions of local European gods, were never targets of demonization, because in the distorted logic that dominated the narrative, what is European is acceptable, while what is African is considered abominable. This logic, forged in the fire of colonialism, still prevails, like a persistent echo of a past that refuses to disappear. African-based religions, even today, face attacks, persecution, and the weight of demonization. Meanwhile, European traditions, even when they share similar practices, are viewed through a lens of respect and acceptance. This is not a coincidence, but the continuation of the colonial project, now without armies, but with churches that perpetuate the cycle of domination. Yet under the watchful gaze of the eternal stars, silent resistance persists. In the chants whispered at the foot of the baobab trees, in the stories passed down from generation to generation, the essence cannot be erased. For the ancestral spirit, shaped in the fire of creation and sustained by the power of memory, resists like an underground river, waiting for its moment to resurface, to claim the space that has always belonged to it. And so, like a new dawn rising, the truth will one day shine in all its splendor, bringing back the harmony that should never have been lost. Under the eternal gaze of the stars, which never stopped watching the journeys of men, lies the dawn of a new consciousness. In 2026, the resonance of the past echoes with renewed strength, and amid the sound of drums that begin to be heard again, an ancient truth awakens. The movement to rescue African traditions pulses with the vigor of a rediscovered heart, and those who were taught to fear are now seeking to understand what it truly means to honor their roots. In towns and cities, from the plains of the Sahara to the forests of the Congo, a rising murmur of personal discovery turns into a collective chant. Sons and daughters of the diaspora turn their gaze to the altars of their ancestors, seeking not only memory, but healing. They recognize that the demonization that once separated them from their essence was not the work of the divine, but of human hands that sought power. And so, when embracing the Inkisi, the Oryxars, and the Vadzimu again, they do not find monsters. but guides and guardians of eternal wisdom. However, the road to reconciliation with the past is filled with shadows that still whisper fear. Churches, with their tall towers and powerful voices, continue to preach against returning to the roots. Shepherds, armed with fire and fervor, burn sacred objects, believing they are eradicating evil, but without realizing that they are setting history itself on fire. Brainwashing, a thick layer of forgetfulness and fear, has become culture, common sense. And breaking these chains requires courage and willingness to see beyond the imposed veil. But beneath the magnitude of the African sky, where each star is an ancestor bearing witness, the question resonates with depth. Are you willing to question what you were taught? For by inquiring, not just into the lessons of the past, but into the very nature of good and evil, a path is opened to a deeper truth. The truth that demons were not those who inhabited the stories of the ancestors, but rather those who manipulated those stories to control and subjugate. The path to this discovery, however, is not easy. It requires dismantling and rebuilding the foundations upon which individual faith was built. A painful process, but necessary, as it is through it that freedom is found. The freedom to honor ancestors without fear, to practice a spirituality that resonates with inner truth, to recognize that the true enemy was never the African spirit, but the narrative that distorted it. And so, the invisible battle continues to be fought, not with weapons of iron and fire, but with the power of remembrance and reconciliation. With each soul that awakens to the truth, resistance grows stronger, like a tree whose deep roots spread across the entire continent, nourishing itself from the fertile soil of ancestral memory. One day, perhaps, the ancestral protectors will be honored as they always should have been, not as demons, but as guardians of a sacred knowledge that has never been erased. Under the silent vigil of the stars, the spirit of resistance persists, awaiting the time when truth and reconciliation can dance together, lighting the way for future generations. For, in this eternal cycle of life, death and rebirth, the essence of what it is to be African, with all its spiritual riches, will never cease to shine as a beacon of hope and resilience for all who seek to reconnect with their roots.